Welcome to Maritime Security Challenges webinar 2020. My name is Jim Boutilier, and 15 years ago I had the pleasant good fortune of initiating the Maritime Security Challenges conference series in 2005. Now, of course, as viewers around the world can appreciate, we've been obliged to fall back on an alternative universe to use a webinar to reach out to each and every one of you in Australia, in Singapore, in Europe, in South Asia, and elsewhere. And I'm delighted to have your participation today. I'd like to begin by thanking the Maritime Security Challenges partners, the Navy League of Canada, the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Waikiki, Hawaii, both resolute supporters of the MSC construct. I'd also like to thank the sponsors for this year's webinar 2020, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, the Canadian Defence Review, Esprit de Corps, and Vanguard magazine. We're going to move on to an introduction, a welcome video from the Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, Vice Admiral Art MacDonald. Vice Admiral MacDonald is the 36th Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, a man with a long and extraordinarily distinguished seagoing career, serving 3 times in the Arabian Gulf, also in the Adriatic, circumnavigating the globe on one of his deployments. He also served in the hurricane, or rather tsunami and earthquake relief in 2010 in Haiti, and he commanded a 7-ship combined multinational task group in the Arctic in the same year, 2010, as part of Operation Inouye. He served as Deputy Commander of the RCN, and he's an alumnus of the Asia Pacific Center in Hawaii. So viewers around the world will see a brief introduction and welcome to MSC 2020 from Vice Admiral MacDonald.
Hi shipmates, I'm Vice Admiral Art MacDonald, Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, speaking to you today from Canada's National Defence Headquarters in the heart of the city of Ottawa, Canada's capital city. On behalf of the Navy League of Canada and the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, I'm pleased to welcome you to the first of the Maritime Security Challenges 2020 webinars. This year's events mark the 9th edition of the MSC conference series. Although we've had a chance to change our format and move it online to ensure safety during the COVID-19 pandemic, we hope that these virtual sessions will enable us to reach a wider audience of international friends and partners while maintaining the exchange of information and ideas that MSC has become known for. Global participation has been critical to the success of these conferences in the past, and this year's program builds what we have learned over the past 15 years of MSC events. Taking the time to be with you here today, albeit virtually, I'd like to seize the opportunity to update you on some of the incredible outputs that our Royal Canadian Navy has been working hard to deliver. We've been steadfastly focused on the future and current stand at the midpoint of the largest peacetime transformation in our history. An exciting time for our Navy. We remain focused on our ships, both their enduring relevance in operations today and advancing the most impressive revitalization of our fleet since the Second World War. For the first time in almost 25 years, the RCN welcomed a new ship to the fleet, HMCS Harry de Wolf, our first Arctic offshore patrol ship. An exciting landmark. This is a big deal, not just for the RCN, but for all of Canada. This ship will give us new capabilities in our north while also being able to operate offshore and internationally. It's important to note that the delivery of our future fleet is not solely about ships. It's about our capacity to stand and deliver in a modern maritime environment as we continue progressing the enterprise effort that sees personnel and training, infrastructure, and doctrine elements being advanced commensurately. The MSC series is, at its heart, about cooperation, coordination, and shared understanding. The RCN is currently deployed in a number of theater of operations, all of which help to illustrate these 3 core elements, whether in the Arctic, Asia Pacific, or Central and Eastern Europe, our commitment to these maritime theaters across the globe remains steadfast. The world has changed since the first conference was held in 2005. An event of this longevity gives us the opportunity to reflect on how our views of the maritime world have shifted over the intervening years. Hopefully, this hindsight will also provide us with the guidance on how to approach the future. The state of affairs in the Asia-Pacific region is a case in point. Many of the trends lending to higher tensions there have been highlighted and followed closely by our expert contributors since the early days of MSC. Discussions of these trends have assisted us in improving our understanding of the emerging strategic landscape in this critical region and around the world. We have watched the steady accumulation of sea power in the Pacific and how this growth has accompanied shifts in regional power. We have seen growing interest amongst our friends and allies for greater cooperation to help secure the global maritime commons, and this collective approach is critical to the future security of that region. Our continued support to the Asia-Pacific with Operations Projection and NEON demonstrate Canada's ongoing commitment to global peace and security and the rules-based international order. We have been operating in the Asia-Pacific region for decades, through my whole career, and plan to continue our efforts in this maritime environment for the years to come. While the MSC series was created to focus attention on the Asia-Pacific specifically, this emphasis does not mean that we can ignore trends elsewhere. This is particularly true for a nation like Canada, which borders 3 oceans and has critical defense interests in the Euro-Atlantic and the Arctic, as well as in the Pacific. Finding the resources to be involved in the security architecture of each of these distinct theaters can be difficult, but forming a shared understanding of the security dynamics impacting these areas is a strong foundation for future success alongside our close allies and trusted partners. Working together with our like-minded partners in the region is incredibly important to protect the maritime order which our economies depend upon. These Maritime Security Challenges conferences are an excellent opportunity to forge and deepen our relationship and shared understanding, and we are grateful to all who have participated over the years as keynote speakers, panelists, and delegates. Although we cannot meet in person to discuss these critical matters, I hope that these virtual sessions will provide new avenues for sharing of insights and ideas to improve our maritime future. Thank you, and fair winds.
I'm delighted, following that welcome from the Commander, Royal Canadian Navy, to introduce our keynote speaker for this first webinar 2020 MSC, and that's Ms. Nadège Rolland, who is an expert on Asia-Pacific defense and security. She's a senior fellow for political and security affairs at the National Bureau of Asia Research, NBR, and she focuses on China's foreign and defense policies. Earlier in her career, she spent some 20 years as an analyst and senior advisor on Asian and Chinese strategic issues at the French Ministry of Defense from 1994 to 2014. And during that period, she was a visiting analyst at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore in 2007 to 2008. She's also the author of China's Eurasian Century, and she will be focusing today on a new and fascinating phenomenon, China's Belt and Road. As each and every one of you listening today are aware, the growth of the Chinese economy in the last quarter of the last century was nothing short of stellar. But there were 2 interlocking and self-supporting phenomena that accompanied that growth. One was the Chinese discovery in Mahanian terms of blue water navy capability. At no time in the history of China have the Chinese ever developed a fleet with the size, the capability, the ambitions, and the scope that are represented in the current People's Liberation Army Navy. And indeed, from a numerical perspective, the PLAN is now the world's largest navy and has fundamentally transformed the global maritime landscape. The other phenomenon that accompanied the growth of the Chinese Navy was the articulation in 2013 by President Xi Jinping of a transformative global phenomenon called the Belt and Road, a plan to bridge the continent of Asia and the Indian Ocean, to link China with Europe and beyond to other continents, to Africa, to Oceania, to South America, and even more recently into the Arctic. So this will be the theme which Madame Rolland will be addressing this afternoon, the Belt and Road, with all of its implications for international security, for China's ambitions, and for the maritime realm. Before I turn to her, however, I might mention that we will be entertaining questions with respect to her presentation. They can be entered in chat at any time, will be collected, aggregated, and passed on to me. And following her presentation, we will in fact have a question and answer session. Let me turn the floor then over to Ms. Rolland to talk about China's remarkable Belt and Road Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boutilier, for this very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak and to open this virtual conference. It's difficult not to be in person in Victoria, but it's an honor to be here with you all today. Belt and Road is probably China's most discussed project worldwide. It's also its least understood, and probably because most of the external observers or commentators actually fail to try to understand it from Beijing's standpoint. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to try to expose some of Belt and Road's features and try to especially highlight how its Chinese architects are thinking about it and why they launched it. So this is my outline. I will try to present very briefly what is Belt and Road, some of its main drivers and objectives, and ending up with a question about Belt and Road as a potential maritime security challenge, since we're talking about maritime security today. Belt and Road is most commonly associated with the idea of infrastructure building, especially transportation and energy. But it's much more than just that. Its scope and scale are extremely ambitious. And very briefly, I would like to give you a picture, literally by the numbers, about what BRI is today. Because it was created out of two speeches by Xi Jinping in late 2013, one in September in Kazakhstan, one in October in Indonesia, which deployed the two main components of this initiative: the Silk Road Economic Belt, its continental component, and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, its maritime component. Two can also be the names by which BRI used to be known. It has two names. One was the One Belt, One Road, or OBOR in its earlier version, and now BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. It's actually one name. It's Idailu in Chinese. It hasn't changed. It's just that the Chinese leadership thought that calling it an initiative would downplay a little bit its strategic intent. Five, because of the five links that compose the Belt and Road Initiative. Policy coordination, infrastructure building is the second link, trade, financial integration, and finally, people-to-people exchanges. So here too, in the links that are the different components of BRI, you can see that it's not just infrastructure building. 1 trillion, it's the amount that China is supposed to want to allocate to the development of BRI, although there has never been an official announcement by Xi Jinping or any of the Chinese high-ranking officials attaching a number, an exact number to what exactly China wants to spend on these projects. Over 3,000, it's the number of projects that are currently underway around the world, infrastructure projects. 65, it's the number of countries that were originally included in the vision that Beijing had for the so-called Belt and Road countries that were mostly on the Eurasian continent. And 138, it's the number of countries that are supposed to be Belt and Road countries today. I think as far as Beijing counts them, and the number was last year, 2019. 6 plus 3 plus infinity. It's a little bit of a joke, but 6 relates to the 6 economic corridors that constitute the Silk Road economic belt. I have tried to draw them on this map that is centered around China, because this is really, I think, an interesting way of looking at the Chinese perspective of its broader strategic environment. So on the map, you can see the dark maroon lines are all the corridors starting from China, extending outwards through Russia, towards Europe, through West Asia, that's the Middle East in Chinese, and Central Asia, all the way also to Europe. There's the China-Pakistan economic corridor. There's the China-Bangladesh, India, Myanmar economic corridor, and the China-Indochina Peninsula economic corridor. In addition to the 6 economic corridors on land, you have 3 blue economic passages that have been added to the Maritime Silk Road in 2017. There's one that goes through the Arctic Ocean, another one down to Oceania and the South Pacific, and the last one is the one that used to constitute the essential 21st century Maritime Silk Road through the Indian Ocean up to the Mediterranean. So that's the 6 plus 3, and plus infinity. It's because in addition to those economic corridors that you can try to represent on the map, there are also a wide array of corporations and domains that are more, let's say, virtual. There's the digital Silk Road that is supposed to be constituted by all the digital connections from China to the rest of the world. There's a Silk Road information corridor that's in outer space. There's the health Silk Road. You might have heard of it, especially since the outbreak of the pandemic. There are a multitude of corporations in higher education, security, agriculture, culture, etc., that are also undertaken under the Belt and Road label. So all of these corporations, all of these activities belong to BRI. So it tells you that it's much exhaustive and comprehensive than building railways or ports in the developing world. So why did China start and launch this initiative? What are the drivers? What motivates this embarking on this ambitious journey? Well, simply put, BRI is both the result of Beijing's assessment of its changing environment and an instrument for Beijing to further shape its strategic environment in a more favorable direction. So there were 2 main events that are key to understand the backdrop on which the Chinese leadership and strategic thinkers have decided to launch BRI. First, it's the global financial crisis in 2008 and the aftershocks of the crisis on the Chinese economy, trying to find new sources of growth for China. So a clear economic consideration. The second one that is key in creating or designing BRI is the so-called pivot or rebalance to the Asia Pacific launched by the Obama administration in 2010. Beijing, seeing an increased presence in the region, American presence in the region, feared of an acceleration of what they felt was becoming a U.S. encirclement more and more important around its periphery, around its strategic space. So BRI is thought as a way to expand China's influence in its backyard. And as you saw on the previous map, it's a 360-degree backyard. And as a way to push back against their perceived US attempt to pressure and contain China's strategic space. It's a very important driver behind this initiative. And so it's a reaction, but it's also a way for China to become more proactive. And Xi Jinping has really marked a shift in China's diplomacy and approach to the outside world by shedding the old advice that Deng Xiaoping made to keep a low profile. Here it's how about China can become more proactive on the international stage and shape the international system, the international environment in ways that are more favorable to the leadership's worldview, to its interests, and reflect the shift, the global shift of the center of gravity towards China. In all the writings in Chinese, you can clearly see that BRI is considered as an instrument to achieve or to serve the achievement of the Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So in other words, it's supposed to help China's rise as the preponderant power in the region. And the China dream has various elements, and including the transformation of China in a strong nation. And to achieve that, self-strengthening is extremely important. It's necessary for China to achieve what they call a comprehensive national power, to become that strong nation and therefore be able to play this preponderant role in the region and perhaps in the world that the leadership wants the country to build on. So BRI serves many different ways to achieve this dream. First of all, strengthening China's economy, helping with maintaining a degree of economic growth, having access to new markets, having access to data also in other countries, supporting China's national champions, its industries, its state-owned companies, expanding its industrial standards, and maybe also internationalize its currency. In the security area, Belt and Road is also envisaged as a way to help China strengthen its energy security by building alternative routes for its pipelines and energy and raw material imports. And China also considers that economic development not just in China, but in other areas, can bring either political or social stability that are very important in terms of security, both for the regime and also for anti-terrorism in general. They believe that if countries are more developed, there will be less problems in terms of insurgencies and terrorism. The last axis is also broader in terms of building China's comprehensive national power on the international stage and build and extend its influence both in international institutions where China can now count on the help and the assistance of many of the Belt and Road countries in the United Nations institutions and organizations. It's a way to expand what the Chinese authorities call China's discourse power, which is in its concepts, its norms, its values, and perhaps its international the rules or the laws that China would want to see asserted on the global stage as well. And finally, it's really, BRI is very focused on the emerging and developing world because China thinks that it can become the leader of the global south, and using those countries to support China's efforts to try to downplay and compete against the West, and so the US and its allies in particular. So turning now to the military dimension, does Belt and Road have a military dimension? The Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping and other high-ranking officials have repeatedly said that BRI is not a geopolitical alliance and it's not a military club, and it doesn't harbor any geostrategic intentions. At the same time, the Chinese leadership has also called for the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, to be ready to protect China's expanding interests abroad. And for the past 15 years, the new historic missions that Hu Jintao talked about at the end of 2004 already put the emphasis on this necessity for the Chinese military to be ready to protect those interests abroad. More recently, the Defense White Paper in 2019 states that the PLA is tasked with safeguarding China's overseas interests, and it identifies some specific overseas missions, such as securing the sea lanes of communications, as priorities for the PLA. Various Chinese strategic writers also feel like, or they also recognize that where the national interests expand, the support of the military forces will have to follow. So military expansion is not the primary driver behind the Belt and Road. We have to believe Xi Jinping and his colleagues when they deny that this is a military endeavor, that this is a military club. But the expansion of China's footprint around the globe, with more and more of its citizens working abroad on these projects, or working, or the assets and interests that China has now in every continent, will at some point require a military protection. So how to address this need while at the same time continue to refute the idea of China's military expansion? I think that this is a conundrum for Beijing, because the authorities are trying very hard to portray China as a peaceful and developing country that have absolutely no intention to either hegemony or expansion, and certainly not using its military instrument. So one way to reconcile those needs versus the image that China wants to project is to think it through Beijing's own lenses, and specifically using this concept of military-civil fusion that was introduced in 2015. A core focus of the military-civil fusion concept is to leverage expertise from the civilian sector to benefit the technical or technological development of the PLA. But beyond this industrial or technological aspect, the military-civil fusion is also about blurring the lines, or breaking down the barriers of that are built between the commercial and civilian sector on the one hand, and the military one on the other, in various situations, and including specifically infrastructure that can be used for dual purposes. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Another important point to keep in mind is that from the PLA's perspective, and specifically for the Navy, given the missions to protect the sea lanes of communications and to safeguard China's overseas interests, the expansion of this geographic scope for potential naval operations will require the establishment of bases. But Beijing does not use the term basis for itself. It used the terms overseas strategic strong points. Djibouti is described as China's first overseas strategic strong point. The Science of Military Strategy that was published in 2013 notes that China must build overseas strategic strong points that depend on the homeland, radiate into the surroundings, and move towards the two oceans being the South Pacific and the Indian Ocean, which is sometimes referred to as China's lifeline. So now let's try to put together all those pieces of the puzzle that I have tried to highlight. We have the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific that are two of the three blue maritime passages, part of the 21st century maritime Silk Road. Along these maritime corridors, China, under the Belt and Road Initiative, is building some transportation and energy infrastructure. The same infrastructure that has been identified by the military-civil fusion concept as potentially useful for dual-use purposes. The Belt and Road Initiative, or the ports that are built under the Belt and Road Initiative, are not necessarily just intended to facilitate the transportation of goods, but they are often part of a cluster rather than just a port. So around that cluster, you have an integration of highways or roads, kind of logistics, transportation logistics available. Sometimes you have airfields next to the port, power grids, industrial parks. You may sometimes have maybe a hospital built by China in the neighborhood. You have maybe some fiber optic networks built by Chinese companies under the Digital Silk Road label. You may have a BeiDou satellite coverage under the Belt and Road Space Information Corridor label. All of that gives you a sense of that integrated system that may be used in part for dual purposes. You could potentially use these facilities for replenishment, for naval ship repair, for intelligence and monitoring, if you're controlling the telecommunication and the data centers of that country or that space, medical assistance, if you have a hospital close by, or all of the above. So of course, there's a gap between what I'm telling now, what I'm saying, and what I'm describing, and what we see now. It might not be the case until a few years from now that we see such a development for the PLA Navy in particular. And as I explained, it's also likely that China will want to build more, let's say, hardened spaces or places that could have a dual use, but maybe we'll start to see emerging, you know, a Djibouti 2.0 or 3.0 along the Indian Ocean, or maybe in the South Pacific as well. On the other hand, some of these places could get China in trouble. BRI could therefore either be an accelerant to China's power projection, but it could also cause problems in places that the Chinese military thinkers haven't quite anticipated. So the next steps may not have been decided in Beijing according to a very well-developed plan. It's possible that Beijing will seize some opportunities as they come up. Also in conclusion, I think the PLA, we need to understand that the PLA Navy in particular has a lot to learn regarding how to operate at long distances. But you know, this map, which is not mine, is trying to identify the potential places in which China may have an interest in developing those, let's say, port clusters in order to perhaps provide some logistical support for its naval deployment in the future. China seems to want to operate along a spectrum, and it's very flexible. So we'll have to follow very closely whether we can see these developments happening on the ground in the years to come. With that, I will close, and I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so very much, Nadège. That was a model of lucidity, very comprehensive indeed. Let me make a couple of observations and then perhaps pose a question to you. One of the things that struck me about the Belt and Road phenomenon is that it lacks a coherent underlying architecture that, like the children's storybook figure Topsy, she just brewed. Belt and Road is an aggregation of initiatives, some of which predate the Kazakhstan initiative in 2013. And we can see that, as you suggested quite clearly, the Chinese have been open to making additions to the larger Belt and Road construct, whether it's in health or whether it's with sudden reference to the Arctic and so forth. So one of the things that interests me is there some overall planning mechanism designed to try to coordinate the activities of hundreds, perhaps even thousands of construction and related firms that are engaged across the width of Eurasia and into Africa and beyond. Secondly, I think that the three great maritime axes that you've described are exceedingly important. It always strikes me that the Chinese are a bit like Churchill's famous comment about the Russians, that they rattle all the windows and knock on all the doors until they find one open, and then they invite themselves in. And the Chinese have, over the space of the past decade and a half, constantly repeated the idea that somehow they're inherently an Arctic nation. It's a near Arctic nation, but the implication is, and of course, for strategists, a growing Chinese presence in the Arctic has some enormous implications. And similarly, far away in Oceania, there's a deep alarm in Canberra in particular, with alleged Chinese interests in establishing port facilities and so on, which could interfere with transoceanic supply routes from the United States to Australasia and so forth. And similarly, of course, we can see that while you quite rightly emphasize the China lens, there's a New Delhi lens that's begun to emerge, particularly in the aftermath of the Galwan Valley clash. Deep and deepening anxiety, I think, in the Indian capital about Chinese ambitions in the Indian Ocean. And that in turn led me to think about your own association with the French Defense Ministry, because France has remained over all of these years in the post-Cold War period deeply committed to the Indian Ocean and into Oceania. And so let me unravel all of that, because they're observations rather than questions. I'd be interested in the first issue, if there's any sort of larger coordination of all of these Belt and Road initiatives. And secondly, what is the French reaction in the Indian Ocean and into Oceania to what the Chinese are up to? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boutilier. That question of about planning and coordination is really key, because it also is one of the maybe the puzzles that we can see in the external commentaries about BRI. There are two schools of thought. One is BRI is just completely dispersed. It is absolutely not coordinated. It's scattered, and there are many different groups of interest pulling and pushing in different directions. It's true to a certain extent, but I'm of the other school who thinks of it as a coherent and as a coherent strategy. But I think when in the West we think about a strategy, we think about means, resources, and ends, or rather ends and then the means and the resources that you want to push or to use to achieve those ends or this objective. And so when we in the West talk about a strategy, we may think we have a very detailed plan in sequence, and we know who the actors are, and we're trying to coordinate these different actors to go to the same direction and have the same effect that we want. I think BRI is a very interesting case of how China does strategy and how it is different from our own Western approach. It is coordinated internally. There are several ad hoc structures inside of the bureaucracy that are specifically dedicated to the coordination of Belt and Road and the general assessment of its progress, and trying to, as much as they can, coordinate the different actors that are on the ground. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that Xi Jinping is every day looking at all the different actors, including the state-owned companies and the PLA and private companies or nominally private companies, and telling them specifically, you have to do this or you have to do that. There's a level of disconnect between what the party central leadership wants and what these other actors are doing. However, what's really interesting is that there's a constant assessment and reassessment. So whatever the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, are doing on the ground, they need to report to the center. Usually they have a party representative inside of their companies that supervises and sends back assessments of progress. And so at some point, the central bureaucracy has the possibility either of pushing or stopping or guiding in a certain direction. So there is a level of planning and coordination, but this system also allows for a lot of flexibility that we might read as waste or as lack of planning, and so it's a different way of operating, I think, and we need to get used to having this in the way that the Chinese system operates in general.
I apologize, Nadège, for interrupting. It's just that I have a flow of questions coming in from our viewers around the world, so perhaps I can waive the question on French interest because it's subsumed in a question from one of the viewers, and that question reads, how is the Belt and Road Initiative affecting European interests? How is Europe responding, particularly in the maritime domain? So, and I've got a number of other questions thereafter, so I'll defer and let you address that if you would be so kind. Thank you.
Sure. So my presentation was mostly to try to maybe get you familiarized with the perspective from Beijing, but everything that I said was a little bit out in a vacuum and not really taking into account what you said, that China is pushing and expanding in areas that will necessarily react or have different perspectives on this increased presence and footprint. And so it really depends where you are. And I think, Dr. Boutilier, you mentioned, in the South Pacific, Canberra is looking at this and China's advances in the South Pacific and potential basing on island states that actually used to be very important during the Pacific War also. I mean, there are not so many places that could be important in times of conflict, and I think that China has identified them the way that Japan used to. The anxieties created in Delhi have been there for a long time, and it's really a game of balancing and counterbalancing. BRI is somehow a response. It's really a response to the U.S. The perception of the U.S. pressure on China's strategic space. But as China wants to expand it and push back against this U.S. constriction of its space, then it constricts other of its own neighbors' space as well. And India is really key here, especially when you saw that last slide and map, the potential BRI countries surrounding or encircling India as well. So the importance of the Indian Ocean is, I think that all of our participants know it, so I don't have to expose it. For countries in Europe, and especially a naval power like France, the Indian Ocean, or what we call now the Indo-Pacific, because of course it's the same theater, is key for its national interests. We have territories in both the Indian and the South Pacific. We have our trade goes through those sea lanes of communication. And so I think the concerns in the Ministry of Defense in France started with China's advances in the South and East China Seas, the constriction of the international law of the sea, and then probably more and more now since the openness of Djibouti as a Chinese base as well, which basically reduces the geographic scope or brings it back closer to home for France in particular. So it's, I think many of the responses that we see are mostly in an effort from many of the advanced industrial democracies in Asia and in Europe to find defense and security cooperation. So there's the Quad format, of course, but France has strengthened its cooperation in defense with Japan, with Australia, with India. So you can see that they're trying to find ways to maybe address and better cooperate with those partners. Not mentioning China, but of course it's the gorilla in the room, obviously.
Let me turn to a question, in fact, two questions from our viewers, and I'm going to conflate the question in a way, in the sense that one of the questions is, to what extent is debt trap diplomacy actually occurring with Belt and Road projects? And the second question is, how much Belt and Road investment is normal, quote unquote, seeking economic return, and how much is seeking strategic ends? So we're looking at some of the economic rationales underlying Belt and Road initiatives.
Right. So this debt trap diplomacy trope became more and more recurrent around 2016, 2017, when specifically because of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. Here you had investments in this port predating BRI, actually, that Sri Lanka was unable to repay. And so the government in Sri Lanka came to an agreement with the Chinese authorities to lease the operations of the port to a Chinese state-owned enterprise for 99 years. And so immediately when that happened, people started, and especially in India, that trope, that trap diplomacy actually came from India first, was worried that this would be something that China would do and repeat in other countries as well. Because Belt and Roads investments are not really investments, so that's a way to answer the second question. It's mostly loans from Chinese policy banks. They're not grants, they're not investments, they're loans to countries that are already fragile, and so it adds to the burden, to the debt burden of these countries a lot. Why is it that those countries still turn to China for them? It's because there's no strings attached. When international financial institutions give some loans for infrastructure in the developing world, they attach very strict restrictions to it, including good governance, environmental and labor protection rights, human rights protection as well. And there's a lot of studies that need to prepare for these loans to be offered to developing countries. China comes without this set of conditions. And so this can be very attractive for some countries who don't want to have any anti-corruption measures or transparency measures applied to their situation. So it sort of weakens and undermines good governance in general. So the question then is whether there's an intent for China to press on that burden to then gain some strategic assets for itself. I think it never appeared in the research I did for many years on this topic that this was the intent. You need to maybe try to understand it as a way to gain influence. And so if you invest in some countries, if you develop ties with some governments, including through corruption, you're going to be able to gain some leverage on their decision making. And that's more of what's behind the Belt and Road scheme. It's not necessarily through, you cannot repay your debt, therefore we're going to seize your national asset, but it's more a network of influence at the local political level that China can use in different ways as incentives, and then as leverage and potentially coercive action. So the investments are, China says that they want their money back, so because it's commercial loans, they still want their economic returns or their financial returns, but it's strategic in the way that they can use this, again, to as leverage to maybe press for some political decisions that don't necessarily have to do with the infrastructure itself in the end.
Yes, I know during my conversations in Colombo, my Sri Lankan colleagues pointed out the fact that in the aftermath of the civil war on that island, they found it virtually impossible to acquire international loans because of the question of what to do with alleged war criminals and so forth. The other example, of course, that comes to mind for me is Pakistan, where the Pakistanis are in a deeply leveraged situation vis-a-vis the international community and indeed China. And this gives Beijing considerable authority in Islamabad.
Right, and one way to think about the kind of influence that China can, let's say, buy through those investments is, for example, the votes of some countries at the United Nations Human Rights Council. So you don't necessarily associate Belt and Road investments in infrastructure with human rights, but this is what happened not a long time ago when China wanted some support for what's going on for its policies in Xinjiang, and there's I think over something like 40 countries, Belt and Road countries, where China has this leverage, that voted in favor of China's repression in Xinjiang. And they outvoted the Western countries that were trying to vote against it. So this is a way that you can transform that kind of economic incentive into a political result and political leverage.
Unfortunately, as the moderator, I'm wrestling with the dictates of the tyranny of time, but there's one final question, and I apologize to our viewers. There are some questioners whose questions I've not been able to address in the time available, but this final question, which perhaps we can address briefly, is what does the Belt and Road mean in terms of China's military relations with Belt and Road countries? And you've alluded to that in part, Nadège, but if you could expand on that briefly, then I think we should bring the Q&A to a close. Thank you.
Yeah, so the military cooperation is it's most of the time it's the one that comes at the further end of the spectrum of cooperation. So in other words, China is not going to start right away on defense and security and military cooperation, but in countries where all the other layers of cooperation have been achieved, you have MOUs and agreements in economic, diplomatic, political, and other areas, then there's this bond or there's this trust that has been built. Then you can start to have some development of cooperation. For many of those Belt and Road countries, it starts with internal security. Through the development of what's called smart cities. So it's more public security. China is exporting its technologies in surveillance, for example, in a lot of those countries. And through that also you have some police training and exchanges going on. And then, only then, usually you have the beginning of a military aspect and cooperation that's held under the Belt and Road label as well. So it's the far end of the spectrum. It doesn't start with this. It really comes at the end of a series of cooperations, and this can take different forms. It's training, it's equipment. Sometimes it's not. It would have to be on a case by case so that I could answer exactly, but you can have some level of military relations as well under the Belt and Road umbrella.
Thank you so very, very much. Wonderfully articulate and comprehensive. I really do thank you for your introduction for all of us viewers around the world on the Belt and Road, a fascinating phenomenon. The Chinese continue to sustain the Middle Kingdom construct, but at no time in their extended history have they ever embarked on a global endeavor of this scale and sort. And so I thank you very much for providing us with a detailed understanding of what Xi Jinping and his colleagues are up to across Asia and indeed across the globe. Thank you again, Nadège, for taking part in this inaugural webinar for MSC 2020.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure, and I'm sorry that we didn't have the time. I think we could speak about it for quite a while, and it will stay there for quite a while still. So we'll have other opportunities to talk about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me draw the attention of viewers to this webinar that a video of the webinar will be available on YouTube. So please search for MSC Conference on YouTube. And let me take this opportunity once again to thank the Maritime Security Challenges conference partners, the Navy League of Canada, the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Waikiki, and to thank our sponsors, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, the Canadian Defence Review, Esprit de Corps, and the Vanguard magazine. And to thank each and every one of you. My heart goes out to particularly those in the Middle East and South Asia who are up very late at night watching this webinar today. But I'm delighted with your loyalty and your involvement. Let me draw your attention to the fact that in 2 days' time, on Thursday, the 22nd of October, at 15:30, not 1600 like today, but half an hour earlier, we will be having a webinar with Professor Greg Poling, and that will be on the South China Sea, which is an issue of enormous relevance and pertinence to all of us as students of the maritime world. The registration is open at www.mscconference, all one word, .com. So with that, let me bring the webinar to a close. We have a final brief Lockheed Martin video, which I'd like to share with each and every one of you. Thank you so much for your involvement today.
At Lockheed Martin, we're on a mission. Your mission. When millions of people are counting on you, you can count on us. To build the impossible, to invent the inconceivable, and solve every problem with speed and reliability. Every mission is an expedition of the greatest importance, both to you and to us.